This is Karan here. I live in Saudi Arabia studying 10th grade in Yambu International School. Today our topic, the interesting topic, is management of natural resources. Now resources, what are resources? We need to understand resources before we actually move on to natural resources and man-made resources. Now resources are those substances which are means of supplying materials held in reserve and which can be transformed into more valuable and useful products. Now resources are distributed into two groups. The first group is natural resources and the second group is man-made resources. Now let's go ahead and look at natural resources. Now natural resources are those substances that occur naturally in the environment and aren't being exploited by the humans for meeting their own needs. Okay? So we cannot create the natural resources. Now for the examples of natural resources, I've listed a few examples over here. Now as you guys can see, any of this example, we cannot create it. Okay? Now man-made resources are resources that are created by man by the form of nature, by mixing materials and things along those lines. Okay? Now resources that are used are those substances which do not occur naturally in the environment, or basically they're made by a man or synthesized by a man or brought up together by a man. Okay, so man-made resources are examples of over here, and you can list more along those lines, such as pesticides, fertilizer, plastics, etc. Okay, now if you can make something, then that's man-made. If you can make something, that's natural. Easily distribution. Now let's go ahead and understand the types of natural resources. Okay, so here we talked about the example. Now we will talk about the types of natural resources, because there's two types of natural resources along this line. So in the natural resources, the first that comes is exhaustible and inexhaustible resources. Okay, now on the basis of availability, there can be divided, the natural resources, as you guys can see, can be divided into two groups: exhaustible resources and inexhaustible resources. Now what we are going to do is elaborate each of these the aspects of natural resources. Okay, so exhaustible resources are those which can get finished due to the continuous use by humans, such as if you continuously use something which is made by natural and it's going to extinct sometime, it's an exhaustible resources. Now inexhaustible resources are those which does not get finished by the continuous use by human beings. Okay, so if you keep using the such as air, it just doesn't get over, because it's a cycle. Plants gives us oxygen, we give them carbon dioxide, they give us oxygen back, and things along those lines. So it does not get over. Okay, now exhaustible resources can be divided into two groups, such as renewable resources and non-renewable resources. So let me go ahead and write it down. This can be divided into two groups, such as renewable resources and non-renewable resources. Now let's go ahead and look at renewable resources. Now renewable resources are those which can renewed by natural recycle or replenished by use judiciously. Now what it means is basically plastic. You can throw the plastic away. They keep recycling them. They recycle every single thing. Now you have seen when you go to a park or a museum, if you have a trash, it says recycle bin. Basically what it means is that it's a renewable resources. Okay, if you throw something in a recycle bin, it recycles itself like a tin, Pepsi tin, Coke tin, or whatever you want to call it, the 7-Up tin or whichever Coke you like. So it's a renewable tin because they don't make tin every now and then. They just recycle them and make a new one out of it, okay, which is cleaned and every single thing. Now non-renewable resources are resources that cannot be renewed. Simple as that. So they both are opposite of each other, as you guys can see. Now as we move on to conservation, okay? So we talked about this. Now let's go ahead and talk about conservation. But before we actually move on, I want to elaborate on what kind of aspects we just talked about. Now we just talked about certain types of resources. Now types of resources we concluded that it divides into two groups: natural and man-made resources. We talked about man-made resources and we talked about natural resources. Now then we elaborated the point of natural resources, which comes into exhaustible resources and inexhaustible resources. And then we talked about exhaustible resources, which comes into renewable resources and non-renewable resources. And I gave you some few examples on it. Now as we move on to conservation. Now conservation basically means that it's controlled utilization of natural resources for the benefit of life. Okay, so it's controlled, it's conserved, as you guys can see from the word itself. It tells us that it's beneficial for us, for the life. It's controlled, it's not overused, or it's not less used. It's just controlled. It's in its equilibrium, as you guys can tell. Now conservation is mainly concerned with the proper management, preservation and protection from destructive influences and misuse of natural resources. So you have misuse of natural resources. It's conserved. It basically what it's trying to do, what's its goal is basically trying to conserve those areas that contains misuses of natural resources. Now third point that I want to elaborate on conservation is that conservation is most efficient and most beneficial utilization of natural resources. Okay, now the fourth point, the last one, is the main aim for conservation is to preserve the biodiversity. Okay, so I just want to write it down because it's the main aim of conservation is the biodiversity. Now as we move on, we don't just want to know what is conservation. We want to know the objectives of conservation. So what are some objectives of the conservation? So there's three objectives that we'll talk about. Is that the first one is basically to maintain essential ecological process and the life of support system. Second, to ensure a proper and planned utilization of natural resources so that these are continuously available for utilization. Third, to preserve biological diversity, which are both genetic and ecological diversity. Genetic and ecological diversity. Okay, it preserves them. Preserves it. Okay, now what we want to do is we want to talk about the types of conservation. Okay, so there's two types that are in situ. Okay, so we named two types of conservation: in situ and ex situ. In situ and ex situ conservation. Now what we are going to do is how this process of conservation depends on. What it depends on is our 3 R's. I made it easier for you guys to understand this the whole process behind it is basically the 3R stands for, let me just write it down. The 3Rs are reduce, reuse, and we all know this, recycle. Okay, so let me go ahead and elaborate each of these 3 points. Now, reduce is because it means we should minimize the use of natural resources, sources of energy, and food materials. Okay, that's why we should reduce it. Now, reuse is basically, this means that we should encourage the use of things again and again instead of throwing them away. That's the reason why you don't crumple the water bottle of mineral water bottle and without recycling it, because it always says at the back on the label that recycle the product, because we need to reuse the product in order to make conservation. You don't just throw away. So next time when you drink water, mineral water or any type of water that has or any substance that but it has a label that of recycle, put it in the recycle bin. Okay, now recycle, this basically means that we should collect the materials like paper, plastic, glass, and metal items and recycle them to get new materials for use. You never know if this marker can be recycled into something that we might like. Okay, I like marker, but it can be recycled into something else. Okay, it could be recycled into plastic material, which is designed creatively and people might want to buy it. Okay, so you never know how much important these 3 R's can make into life. Now, sustainable development is what we are going to talk about. So let me just go ahead and erase these things. Now, as you guys can see, we are going back into natural and man-made resources, because this all are dependent on natural, the types of resources. Okay, not just natural resources, but also the man-made resources. So what we are going to talk about right now is basically sustainable development. Sustainable development. Now, sustainable development means that the development that stresses on judicious use of natural resources to meet the current basic needs of the humans, while preserving the resources for which we need in future generations. So it basically preserves right now for later on use. That's basically it. So that's the sustainable development. So it preserves materials for future use. We can just say future purpose. Okay, so that's basically it. Now as we move on to forest conservation. Now, forests have basically 3 points. Okay, now that is, forest may be regarded as any land management for diverse purpose of forestry. Second is that the plant community, predominantly of trees and other vegetation, usually with close canopy, is called the forest. Third, Indian forest can be divided into 5 types. Okay, since Indian forest is so diverse, we can use it as an example, and it can be diverse into 5 different types. That is, so we're talking about can be divided into 5 types: evergreen forest, second is deciduous forest, third is dry forest, fourth is hill forest, fifth one is tidal forest. Okay, so these are some types of forests that we talked about, that we'll talk about. And the importance, why is forest important? Well, the importance of forest is what we are going to talk about. And the importance of forest is that the forests are only source of timber, wood, fuel, bamboo, fodder, and rich sources of variety of valuable products. Now, we all know it's a forest house over here in Saudi Arabia, America, are basically made up of wood. So what they want to do is basically conserve this wood that comes, that is made, that is used to build houses, are used from the forests, not just Indian forest, but forest anywhere they can find timber, wood, which is basically found in the forest. Now, what's the second important thing? Well, the second important thing is that forest guards against erosion of land, damage of water shields, and floods and sedimentations. Third is that forest provides facility of grazing livestock. Fourth, forest provides raw material like manufacture of number of things such as paper, gum, resins, bed leaves, essential oils, and number of drugs. And also I want to add that glue, because there's a tree that provides glue to us, because it provides numerous things. We get numerous things from forest, and we know that. Okay? Now, it also balances the temperature of area. If you have a forest next to your house, it basically means that you're gonna have cool temperature around you. It's basically saying that if you live next to the seashore, you're basically going to enjoy the scenery, going to get cool environment even if it's a summertime. Okay, that's basically it. Same with the forest. They also provide shelter and food to wildlife and tribal people. Well, no one's gonna let tribal people and wild animals enter their house. Well, forest basically helps them, give them a shelter so they can live there, and they can depend on numerous things. Basically, tribal people basically depend on wild animals for their food and so on. They also, what they do is basically, since there's lots of trees, what they do is take in carbon dioxide and provide large amount of oxygen. That's the reason why if we start planting less and less trees which are separated by a humongous distance, you're not gonna get a large amount of oxygen. It's basically the forest that gives us the large amount of oxygen and algae that we talked about in our previous sections. Now, people appreciate the natural beauty and the appearance of the forest. Is basically saying that if you live next to the forest, your parents might like it because it's so good scenery. Like I already told you, it's like saying you live next to the seashore. You have ocean waves coming and so on, so you might enjoy the scenery. Same with the forest. Okay, now deforestation. What we'll talk about is basically about deforestation. Now, deforestation is basically destruction, reduction, and removal of forest covers. Now, the reasons why we actually do that, and I know it's bad, but the reasons why we actually do that, there's basically 5 reasons, is that cutting off trees, shifting agriculture, overgrazing, construction of road, highways, and railways, dams. 5th one is basically forest fires. That's the reason why deforestation is possible, and we need to do it. Now, the conservation of forests. So how do we actually conserve it even after deforestation? Now, conservation basically means that development and management of full protection of existing forests so they can provide as much as optimism, sustainable yield. Now, measures of conservation: replenishing of trees. That means more and more trees should be planted so there's no scarcity. This is called afforestation. Conservation sources of energy like LPG, biogas should be used instead of wood, charcoal, etc. Because some people in the winter, mostly in India, what they do is basically cut off wood and charcoal and basically light them up. Well, basically that's wrong use of wood you have there, right, buddy? So what they want to do is use some gas kind of substance like biogas, LPGs, okay? So it might be helpful than using the wood, charcoal, and number of things that they do. Now, modern method for forest management should be employed. More and more technology should be invested in forest. Deforestation should be reduced to minimum and should be followed by reforestations. Now, Chipko movement is basically a method of non-violence resistance against tree that people started in India started by Indian villagers as it's known as Chipko movement. So they don't want any deforestations, and this I included because it's important to know that this thing actually happened all around the world. Now, if I find something somewhere in America, somewhere in Russia, something like this along that is related to our section, I'll surely include it, but it always seems that India comes first in my mind because I'm Indian. Okay? So in the movement, the Indian villagers hugged the trees and prevented the contrarians from cutting them. So what they wanted to do is basically, it's worthwhile to watch the video of Chipko movement and how it started, but here's just a little summary. Is that the people, Indian villagers back in the days, people used to cut down the trees, and while cutting down the trees, the Indian villagers didn't have anything in the winter. So what they wanted to do is basically cut down they used to get lots of resources from the trees. Now the Britishers, the soldiers, the army people came and started cutting down the trees, and they didn't really like it. It's like saying that if you're playing your video game or anything that you're related to and someone just takes it away, you won't like it, right? So it's just same thing towards them. So what they did was hug their trees and stop them from cutting it, and it basically began in Rajasthan, which is in Gujarat. Okay? So wildlife. Now, how is wildlife important to us? Well, they basically maintain ecological balance. They provide great biodiversity, biological diversity, mainly uses for obtained from wildlife. Now, ways to conserve things was that maintenance of wild and protected areas, protection of nature habits, national parks and biosphere reserves should be encouraged, and sanctuaries should be formed and due to care should be taken. Now, not just forest, we should also take care of the forest. We don't just want forest for the heck of it. We should also imply health care and stuff along those lines for the people, the tribal people and animals who live along those lines. And animals should be shifted to natural parks or animal zoo. Okay. Water conservation. It can basically be done by judicious use of water. Rainwater should be harvested. Rainfalls should be harvested. Construction of dams should be encouraged because when the water falls, it goes into recycle that we just talked about a few seconds ago. Now, treatment of wastewater. Whatever water that is wasted, there should be a treatment of getting that purified water back. We want waste to get out and purified water to come in. Okay, storage of water should be encouraged as well. Now, basically, here we are for the end of the section, and I hope you guys liked it. So there's a Facebook link down below this description, in the description box. So what I want you guys to do is basically click on that Facebook page and give it a like, comment if you like this video, enjoyed it, and give this like on this video so I know how your feedbacks are, and comment down below on saying how was the video, how did it help you, and how actually you can improve the forest, the destruction of the forest. What creative ideas do you have? I want them to see. I want to see your ideas on how you actually express your ideas. Thank you for watching.